Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Monday at about 9:30, 9:26 to be exact. So yeah, I like to with this channel, I love to try to do some videos that are bringing some different viewpoints. Not always sticking with just straight up like movie reviews or talking about movies that I love or the experiences that I have. I love to try to bring variety to this channel. So today is like a show along those lines where it's not going to be a review show today of a movie. There will be one coming that I'm excited about talking about. It's mostly going to be about the whole situation around more or less being a critic, in the film world, especially in this day and age. There's a massive platform for really everyone in the world. If they want to voice their opinion, they can kind of create their own opinion, and that can be really good. And in some ways, I think with all of the technology that we have at our fingertips, there's there there are always, when there's a new, when technology or when social matters are kind of arrive at a new place, or to a degree they evolve. There's always going to be pluses and minuses about those things. Obviously, you know I I have said a lot about the streaming situation, the experience of going to a movie theater, physical media. I've covered those things a lot, and I've also talked about the experience around also being a musician, or and musicians that I look up to, filmmakers that I look up to, how they navigate trying to talk about, and from different angles, different perspectives on how we try to navigate through the complexity with with technology. The Because one thing I think one thing that whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, having a kind of a black and white viewpoint of something. One thing I think everybody across the board can agree on is that you can't stop it. You can't complain about technology to a point and say, well, I just want to put it in a box and put it in a closet and just forget about it. Because that is just not possible. It's always evolving and always changing, and it's now a regular part of our interaction in everything that we do as people. The way we communicate ideas. So it's really a process of people in the entertainment business, if you will. It's really just a process now of trying to realize how different the territories are, but you have to try to adjust to all of these new things, and also because technology is such a factor, you have to really be able to try to hopefully adjust to things. And that I think that affects all things, from people who are performing music, people who are creating films, anything in the arts. People, and also with the platform of YouTube, where people can voice their opinions, you know, um, regardless of, say, like when I think of the time of, say, before technology, critics would typically write reviews for films in the newspaper, or there would be television shows. Siskel and Ebert is a great example of that. And these guys were at the time looked to be, professional writers. Their lives were about reviewing films. And so it came to down to where, you had quote unquote, specialists, people who were trained in actual journalism to be critics. So with YouTube, you have this thing of where, well, you don't need to have, an education, an Ivy League education in journalism to be able to talk and voice your opinion. And if you're a fan and you're passionate about something, you know, this day and age, you can create this small little platform, regardless of that. And again, that's good and amazing, and also it brings a lot of problems. But it's a regular occurrence. One, when I really got into, you know, getting with the idea of expanding my channel, for about 6 years, 5 or 6 years, when I got into talking about film and, more or less acting as a reviewer, it was just on my Facebook page. And then eventually I got into the live video format, got really into that. And that's something I probably love the most. And I had a real reluctancy to get into YouTube because it just seemed, I don't know, kind of intimidating and daunting. But then I eventually did it, and that's now, along with my Facebook page, my Film Fanatic Facebook page, and also my Instagram page. And then I also use my personal page. The main focus now has, shifted the last year, over a year, yeah, a year and a half now, has been this YouTube channel. This has definitely become the priority. This is now, like, I don't know, for what it's worth, and it's kind of a small potatoes operation, but for what it's worth, now it's like the main focus is the YouTube channel, and then everything else comes after. For a long time it was just about putting up posts on Facebook and kind of, expanding on that. But so now everything is to a degree secondary after that. But, when I was really thinking about, you know, diving into the whole YouTube kind of revolution, if you will, I had lots of inspirations. I started watching lots of YouTube guys, and I started to really get excited. And one of the guys that really played a key role, and somebody I really admired at that time, and somebody I still actually like, although things have shifted a little bit, is Chris Stuckman. Chris Stuckman is one of the most well-known YouTube guys. He's probably, when it comes to film critics online in the YouTube universe, he's probably the biggest guy, biggest name. He mostly specializes in newer films, a big focus, also a real big focus on horror films. And I have come across and, been made aware on so many great films by watching his channel. I always loved his kind of level of professionalism. I've always loved that he is not, I don't know, he doesn't attack filmmakers in a way or try to create these headlines to just garner attention. I think it's from a genuine place. I think it's really sincere, and I think he's educated. So, and that he's one of many YouTube people that I really, especially at the time before I dove into trying this whole crazy thing, that I really admired, and I still do, and really inspired me to, well, okay, it's a small potatoes operation, but why not try it out? It could be a fun, fun little adventure, and diving into anything, you know, you know, to a degree artistically, requires. I've always felt that when you have a, you know, when you launch into a new area, there's always, you kind of always need a skill set behind you. You need to develop a better language on how to express those things. And there's, in every walk of life, especially in this area, there's, there's a discipline, there's a level of learning, there's, again, acquiring a skill set, developing, focusing on realizing your weaknesses and your strengths, trying to develop on those things, and everything hopefully evolving, and hopefully gaining more knowledge on how to better articulate things. And so, he was and continues to be a huge inspiration. And he's kind of my go-to guy pretty much for to this day of, as far as, I talk mostly about older films on this channel, but I really try to stay current. I try to really, keep my finger on that pulse. There's a lot of really great newer films I have seen and that I talk about, and a lot of those films were movies, and viewpoints on those movies that Chris Stuckman has expressed. So, it's a thing that I try to stay current in all of those situations, or and in those different worlds. And the last couple of years, Chris Stuckman has said that, he is now officially a filmmaker. He just wrapped his first film. It's coming out, I think, this year. And he's always talked about wanting to actually become a director, and which has been his dream. And now he is officially, a filmmaker. And so this video is about that situation to a degree, but it's mainly this situation because I hear people talking about it, and it is, I think, a valuable topic, or a valuable, argument to make. But he definitely, since he has shifted into becoming, a director, an actual filmmaker, his format of his show has changed drastically, very, very different. And so he's talked about, the obvious situation of now that, when you've gained that experience of being a filmmaker, and wearing that hat, and, throwing your hat in the ring, if you will, you're seeing it, the art of film, from a different perspective. I know for me, I've dabbled in that world with photography, shooting video, and also shooting film. And it the main thing those experiences did for me was it increased my hunger for film and my appreciation, especially around the process of filmmaking, realizing, wow, this is the most complex, also the greatest art form that there is. Where it gave me this whole new kind of profound respect for filmmakers, realizing, it's the ultimate form of expression, artistic expression, I feel, but it's also the most complicated because you have like one person who is acting as like this general, but he has to collaborate with hundreds of people and also multitask, on at the highest level, wearing multiple hats constantly, and having to worry about so many things all at once. And to the point of where it almost seems impossible that you can get all of these tasks done. My experience with that has given me a newfound respect for filmmakers. And so he's done that officially, but his reviews have changed now, where he has more or less, he doesn't really, if he comes across a film that he does not particularly think is great, he has really kind of pulled back his reserves. He's really kind of pulled a lot of, introduced a lot of restraint in his reviews, and is reluctant to really, criticize, like really criticize from an educated stance. But he's really reluctant to kind of criticize certain films, and his views have changed very much. And there is a recent show that he did where he talked about um, this new Marvel movie, Madam Web, which is this latest kind of spin off Spider-Man movie. And I haven't seen it. I don't really have an interest in seeing it. I probably at some point will. I've talked a lot about my fatigue around comic book movies. I'm a huge comic book fan. I own a ton of Marvel movies and also DC movies on Blu-ray. I'm more of a Marvel guy, but I have been very, very, very disappointed the last year or two with a lot of these newer Marvel movies. It's just kind of been this. I feel like each film has just been this like regurgitated product over and over again, and also these newer incarnations of films are just kind of more sanitized and curated, and are just more they just don't take any risks, and they lack any kind of originality. And so I've had a lot of fatigue around superhero movies for a while now, and and so I've really kind of stepped back from it. And to be honest, I'm not one to ever play that card, and I don't think I ever have, but I understand it. That whole idea of, where people, I call it, well, I call it the grandpa syndrome, where you sit around, and it can you usually see it and hear it around music and film a lot of the times. That's the typical, those are the two typical things that are usually, synonymous with it. And when I say the grandpa syndrome, I mean like where somebody will complain about newer things, and they just say, well, they kind of bitch about it and say, well, they don't make them like they used to, and I'm not one to usually believe that. And to a point, and for the most part, when someone usually takes that stance, they're usually, kind of not acknowledging anything new that's come out in recent time that is good quality. So, and I understand that view. Like most of the films, I did a big show the other day on my top horror exploitation movies, my favorite horror exploitation movies of all time. And it was a really fun show. It was actually a lot of work. It was hard because my first top five was easy. After that, I love so many different kinds of movies, It was hard to kind of like focus on it, reel it in, and to actually kind of make a list or form a list. It was actually hard, but it was super fun. And 99% of those films that I talked about were all from the 70s. It was funny because when I did that list, I tried not to spend a lot of time thinking about it. I wanted to be like, my follow my gut instincts. Movies that I just watch a lot. Movies that I just, that I always go to. Movies that just make me excited. That's all I based it on. And I just was like, okay, I'm gonna grab that, and this is my list. Go. It was that thing. I didn't want to like sit there and think about, well, I don't, I should have covered a little. I should pick my favorite newer films. I should pick, maybe some of the '80s films that I grew up on, or maybe I should throw in a comedy. I just was like, no, let's just do it. So that's how I did it. So I just based it on instinct and really my habits, and it was funny because reflecting on the video after I watched it and whatnot, I realized there was not one new movie or newer film in the entire category of films that I talked about. They were all, there were, obviously a lot of films in the 80s, but about 95% of them, looking back, were all from the 70s. And I've always said in lots of these videos that the 70s, is easily my favorite decade. So it was interesting. It was kind of a eye-opening experience. But that being said, I do reviews of a lot of newer films. I mean, I've talked many times. I've done two shows on this film, but my favorite film of last year was Godzilla minus one. I think it was by far the best movie experience I had all last year. There were some very good movies that came out last year, but I thought this movie was so special and it was head and shoulders above everything and anything that I'd seen. Just it was that I don't know, it was that cinematic experience that I've been just burning to have again. And I just feel like I haven't had that in a while. And it was just so satisfying. And it had way more of an emotional impact on me than I ever thought. I would never have really thought per se that a kaiju movie would be, kind of an emotional movie to that degree. So I do love new films, and I have talked about Godzilla minus one. I've done two videos on it, and and that's a big example of a very modern movie. But I will have to say, overall, my whole thing around new movies that I've rented, I go to Opera House Video still, and I try to stay up on checking out what new movies are coming out, and basing, a lot of the films that I have gotten through there, new releases, and then films that have been out in the theater. I honestly, and I have talked about it, but I have been, really disappointed with a lot of films and newer films, and I'm not sure why that is. I think there's a lot of complex reasons behind it. I think there's a lot of, you know, um, different views, but it's something I think about. It's something I think about very, very much. And basically, getting back to the Chris Stuckman thing, he basically, I have not seen Madam Web, but I'm not really interested in seeing it. But it has gotten a tremendously amount of bad reviews. So, and he got criticized for basically defending the film, at least the film's director. And, but he did go after the studio quite a bit. And he's basically was saying on how, in the modern time of where we are, things have always been about the dollar. If something brings commerce, if something is going to get people in the seats and to spend their hard-earned money, that's all that matters at the end of the day. That's what it is. So, and from a marketing standpoint, trying to focus on those on that demographic, like that's what it comes down to. It comes down to dollar and cents. But he basically was defending the movie in a lot of ways, and not really, to a degree, not really criticizing the studio that put the film out, but not criticizing the director. And basically, what he was kind of saying was, and I should step back a little bit, but since he's kind of become a director in film himself, he really has pulled back as far as criticizing films. And I think in this day and age, obviously you have people who can criticize things heavily, almost, tear things apart, but you can do it in a real, smart, thoughtful way and still be really respectful. You have a lot of people online who are quote unquote film critics, but they will basically just attack everything, and it almost becomes this personal thing, and they want to create this kind of shitstorm atmosphere because that gets hits, that gets likes, that gets people to subscribe because it's that, you know, driving down the street and seeing a car accident. So that's what they do, and and that's the bandwagon. And I understand that. I understand the game of that, but to me, it's like it's not really about being a critic. It's just kind of creating this shit storm, and it's just about that person. It's not really about the film anymore or that review. But I understand that, and that's used constantly. Well, people will put really controversial or salacious text in their reviews to try to like garner attention, and it works for a lot of people. But I think in Chris Stuckman's world, he's actually very smart. He's articulate, and in the past he would very much give a film a very bad review, but he never did it in a I don't know, in a nasty way. He was always respectful, but he was highly critical of films. The last Star Wars movie is one very highly critical. But he did it in an educated way. He didn't do it in a like a schoolyard bully, meathead kind of way. Whereas I feel most people attack films with that mentality. They're not as smart, they're not as educated as someone like Chris Stuckman, and they don't have and a lot of the times when it happens, there's no respect to anything. But Chris Stuckman has definitely changed radically since he's become a filmmaker, where now he kind of doesn't really criticize films nowhere near as much. It's different. He does, but it feels like he is. It might be a strong way to put it, but it almost feels like when he's doing that, it's kind of like where he's like walking on eggshells. I don't know. Like he has this level of being cautious as opposed to like, no, just expressing his opinion. He's a smart, articulate guy who knows what he's talking about. He's educated. Just letting your opinion flow. That doesn't seem to be the case now. It's always like there's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but there feels like there's an area of trepidation or this idea of like walking on eggshells because you don't want to step on someone's toes. I don't know, and I get it. So like what he was talking about, especially around this movie, he was saying, well, in today's Hollywood climate, you have all of these studios that are basically, they own, well, like Disney, for instance, own the rights to these characters, to these franchises, and it's kind of evolved even more to where it's a cash cow, and they have this formula and this demographic of an audience, so they just want to really, really target that audience and just make the money that they can, in this cash grab kind of way. And there seems to be even more interference when a director is hired to do a film. They're always the general consensus from what I get of a lot of these Hollywood films is that, and it's always been a problem, but it seems more now there's more studio pressure on those directors. There's more cooks in the kitchen, if you will, than ever, So it's that kind of give and take. But he was basically saying that you have these people that are writers and directors in the film, in these various products and various films, and they are getting control. They're getting lambasted all the time. They're getting all this pressure, but they're still pushing forward and putting out these movies as essentially a calling card, or the experience. So one day they can actually do, maybe that studio at some point will greenlight a project of theirs that is a personal movie or something that is just them directing it. There isn't any studio interference, so they're using this as this way. They're using these films as like breaking into the industry, and regardless doing it for the sake of that, in those under or within those kind of horrible constraints, but doing it to eventually maybe get your own voice out there. And um, but and I understand that, but I think there's been some movies that I have seen where I think that's the case. I have not seen Madam Web, but there have been some cases that I have seen, especially in the newer Marvel movies, that I've seen some films that I have felt that they are just very, very disappointing and to a degree sometimes atrocious. And I'm like, okay, at the end of the day, I understand they're trying to make this money, but when you look over the span of the last few years, these big bloated films, especially in the Marvel universe, have been tanking. They have been just being they have just been not making any money at all and bombing severely in the theater. But yet it seems a lot of these studios are still pumping out, churning out the same product over and over again, and it's astounding to me that when clearly they're doing something that is clearly not really connecting with the audience, but yet they're persistent on it and they're just wasting billions of dollars. I think ever since Endgame and Infinity War and then the last Spider-Man movie, that's been this thing. With the exception of the two animated Spider-Man movies that are awesome. I think with the exception of those two films, we have seen this, horrible decline in quality, but yet it's still being pumped out there all the time. And so he's like, Chris Tuckman is talking about Madam Web, and again, I have not seen this movie, but he's saying, for all intents and purposes, the reviews for this film have been absolutely horrible. And so a lot of people are saying, like, this whole thing is not, it's clearly not working, and it's just a disaster. And I always come away when I've seen a lot of these newer films, especially in the Marvel universe, I'm just like, what are these people thinking? Do they have any kind of, you know, conscious, or any, are they objective to anything? Do they even like, how, like, to a degree, how do they sleep at night knowing that they can put their name, that they'll put their name on this product or movie that is just, just really awful and just bloated and stupid, and I'm just like, how do they do that? Like, I don't understand it, and they are smart people. So how does that happen? And I don't know. It's like, and Chris Stuckman has gotten to a place of where he doesn't really review the films. If it's a film he does not like, he doesn't really act as a critic anymore, for good or bad. So it's a little bit disheartening. But I think about all the talk and how these movies are being made, and that there's like an unusual amount of pressure. There's more cooks in the kitchen. There's more, the industry itself is more fragile than it's ever been. I always think and refer to stories about, Francis Ford Coppola when he directed The Godfather, or Ridley Scott, for instance, when he directed Alien and also Blade Runner. Many, many stories around that. But the stories of those directors struggling with the filmmakers, struggling with the studio, or the executives at the studio, you know, brutal, brutal. I have The Godfather is my favorite movie of all time, and there's an amazing amount of special features on there, and I've seen all kinds of documentaries about that film, and numerous times Francis Ford Coppola talked about that situation of, like, when he was on set, he was getting so much pressure, from the studio on wanting to make these cuts or changes, but he was like, trying to be steadfast and drawing a line in the sand. So he was conflicting and at war with the studio the entire time. And he talks about it often where he felt every day that he was on the set, he could get fired at any given moment. And this was a Paramount movie, one of the biggest studios in Hollywood at the time, massive budget at the time, so much at stake, adapting, from Mario Puzo's book, the pressure of that, all of those things. So much pressure. And and for all intents and purposes, when I see those stories of that struggle within the studio, I almost feel like, from what I've heard about what is happening now, and this was in the 70s, Coppola's situation was far worse. Far worse. And that whole thing, when you're dealing with massive amounts of money and a lot of things riding on a final product, there's gonna be like immense amounts of pressure on every front. So I'm like, I don't think that like that's anything different. And when I look at it at the situations, now and then, for all intents and purposes, my first reaction is I feel, well, what Coppola went through, and it went on to become this masterpiece of a film. For all intents and purposes, what he went through was worse. So I don't know. Like, I just feel like, well, that's a thing. That's how that is a situation that comes along with making films, especially large scale films that are financed by major studios. I don't know. I don't understand. So I don't know if it's a thing of where it's used or it's talked about now in light of newer studios, or say new films, as a way of, I don't know, maybe giving the filmmakers and the studios a pass, or especially the writers and the creators. I don't know. Like, it seems, for all intents and purposes, like I said, what, for example, Coppola went through was worse. I don't know. It's an interesting question. And the other thing that's really interesting is, recently I had Asif Akbar on my show, and he was awesome. He's a filmmaker, and he's worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Mel Gibson, Mickey Rourke. It was great. It was great. He was an awesome guest, and he brought some opinions to the table that, and different angles and views that I never really thought about, and I thought was very interesting. And again, that's what hopefully this channel is about, and especially when it comes to interviews, I love to have different perspectives, brought to the table. So, and we talked a lot about lots of different things, but I tried to keep the interview focused on his perspective. Like, I wanted to kind of give this angle to people who are checking out the video, the angle of, okay, what's it like in 2024 to be a filmmaker? Go. From your perspective, what is that like? Directing, shooting, writing, the marketing, navigating, how, in this kind of strange time of theater versus streaming, or both. I want to hear that perspective. So that's what we really got into. And it was interesting too, because like I like expressed one of my favorite things to do is to go to the movie theater. I love, for me it's an essential thing. I think I think at the end of the day, movies are pure escapism. And for me, it's about going into that dark room with maybe friends or strangers, and getting lost in that film through sight and sound. But in a theatrical way, meaning going to the theater and having that ritualistic, experience, because I feel like anything outside of that just does not give you that level of richness around that experience. That's just always been my opinion. And by nature, as people, we are social creatures. So it's also part of that. And that brings us back to, how we've been for thousands or millions of years as a species. We like that ritual aspect. We like that communal interaction. It's all part of that. And so I have said too, I have lots of problems with streaming. Why I don't stream is I've found the quality is not really good. Um, I watch movies and buy lots of movies at home. I own lots of movies. I watch them all the time. And I find, if I get a really good Blu-ray version of a film as opposed to say watching it on online, to me, even in that as that being an example, the quality is superior watching it on Blu-ray because there's no compression put on the film when it's streamed. Or there's no when films are streamed, there's a vast amount of compression. So things tend to be too dark at times. The sound is not really fantastic. You don't really have a level of the dynamic or sonic range. Pixelation a lot of times is off, but I find with home use, being with physical media, you get pretty damn close to having that theatrical experience. Sometimes it will be actually better. And for me, it's just about quality. And so as of Akbar, he was talking about that, and I said, well, what do you feel like as an artist, and you've been doing this for like 20 years, and you've worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. What is your experience around, do you want people to see your film in the theater? And it was interesting because he was saying on how it's not really even part of the equation to a degree because he said unless you're like Christopher Nolan or Steven Spielberg or Denis Villeneuve, where you're these are directors that have a massive voice and have lots of power in Hollywood, and get their films all the time put into the theater for the most part. He said unless you are those in that circle, your film is not going to get a theatrical release, or if it does, it's going to be so small, and that area is kind of closed off. It's like this exclusive club. It was interesting. And he said that this day and age, he feels it's the best time for filmmakers because he said with all the streaming platforms and all the digital devices that people have, you now can show your movie anywhere, and people can see it anywhere. And so he felt as a filmmaker he has even more opportunity than ever, you know. So it was an interesting perspective. But in my opinion, for me as being a fan of film, I really I don't know, I really take an issue with that, and I I don't know, it's like I have a completely opposite opinion of that as and that's just from being a fan of film, you know. I want that experience. I want, if I'm going to spend money on a on a movie and take that time to set aside that time to experience that film, I want it to be of the highest quality possible. I want it to be an experience. I don't want it to be something that is, I don't know, just because I can access it quick, or it's like a quick fix thing. Well, I can just watch it on my phone, or I can just watch it on my iPad, or I can just watch it on a crappy little TV at home, just for the sake of because it's easy and it's convenient and it's cheap. Because I know it's for me, it's like a watered down, a kind of a dumbed down version of experiencing the art. I don't have, for me as a fan, I just don't get that experience. I'm not fully immersed. The detail, the richness of that film is the translation is for me totally lost. I don't get that experience of immersion. And I feel like at the end of the day that's what film is. And so I don't know, it's a very complex thing, very very interesting topic. I kind of touched on two different subjects as far as getting back to the streaming and the theatrical presentation of a film, and also and I should add, when I talked about, for instance, when Asif Akbar was talking about kind of this almost notion or idea of like an exclusive club, using Christopher Nolan as an example, or Steven Spielberg or Denis Villeneuve, where they can get their films in the theater. They have that clout, they have that power. They can get their films put, to run in every IMAX theater around the country. But he was kind of looking at it. If you're outside of that and if you're not Christopher Nolan, there's almost no way that you can kind of penetrate that through distribution. And he kind of made it into this thing of where it is, kind of a club, that you can't, on the outside, you can't really, penetrate that fortress. So it's kind of interesting. But that being said, like I was talking about what Chris Stuckman and the strife that filmmakers go through now, and using that as example, comparing it to, everything that I've read about, say, Coppola, for example, of what he went through in the studio, and I kind of came to the conclusion, and I always I more or less I've reached that conclusion that I feel, well, all intents and purposes, it's always been hard. It's not anything different. If anything, it might have been worse back then, what Coppola went through. In regards to this Hollywood system, you have Nolan. If you're not, at the end of the day, he was more or less saying, if you're not Christopher Nolan, you're not going to get that kind of distribution. You're not going to get all your films in these different theaters. Again, comparing that situation to now, and then also, say, in the 70s and 80s, most of the films that all the films that I talked about in my big review of my favorite horror films of all time were all pretty much exploitation movies that worked totally out of the Hollywood system. I do love big budget Hollywood films too, but from what I've read about that period, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, on the at least from the industry level, the view and the kind of this idea of the exclusivity of Hollywood, I don't feel it was any different back then. Where these studios, to penetrate, directors to kind of penetrate that, the kingdom of the big budget, was incredibly hard back then. It was near impossible. And then you had that, but then people who were basically kind of giving a middle finger to that Hollywood system and being like, well, we're going to just do it guerrilla style. So I don't think that's changed either. I think that's just kind of, it's a corporation. Corporations are run with a very specific methodology. And so during that time of the 70s, just like my Coppola example, I don't really see a difference. It's like maybe it was just as hard, if not harder then. From all stories that I heard about people directing films in the 70s, in battling with studios, and all of these situations of, trying to penetrate Hollywood. I don't know. I don't see it any different. I think it's just it's a beast, and how you deal with that beast. And how you navigate with it. But now those things in our year now, and in this decade that we're at, and now those things are kind of looked at in the light of where, well, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to do those things. I don't know. It's an interesting discussion. But anyway, that's going to wrap up this long discussion about those two different issues. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.